In the last few months, YouTube atheists have been steadily releasing videos in which they respond to questions posed by Matt Slick. And I should say now that, other than the fact that he's a Christian apologist and that he embarrassed himself on The Daily Show, I don't know much about Matt Slick, and frankly, I'd rather keep it that way. His questions, however, are old hat at this point, but there's one in particular, number 15, that caused a lot of atheists to reveal their scientism, or to perhaps sloppily defer to scientism without much thought. The question asks, must God be known through the scientific method? Here's how a few atheists responded.
There is nothing anyone can honestly say they actually know about their various religious beliefs. Knowledge is justified belief, meaning that it can be tested and demonstrated with measurable accuracy. And if you can't show it, then you don't know it. If there is no way to confirm your convictions to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you cannot actually know what you think you know. You only believe you know that. And everything we actually do know, we learned from science. So if God were real, there would be a way to know him through science, too.
As far as I can tell, yes. I don't know of anything. I don't know of a better way. I don't know of any other way to know anything about external reality. When I take in information about the external world, the world outside my own mind, I need to make empirical observations, and in order to know whether those observations are reliable, I have to test them. And, well, then I'm doing science. The alternative to science is speculation.
I don't know, I guess that he must be known through the scientific method, or if not the scientific method, at least through some sort of empirical data, or some sort of highly reasoned, airtight, ironclad argument that no one can refute.
The answer to that question, I think, has to be yes, because outside of the scientific method, I don't know how you know anything other than maybe your own private thoughts, you know? I mean, but even if you say, well, God reveals himself to you, you know, how do you determine whether what you are experiencing is a genuine revelation from God or just a delusion that you are experiencing, or maybe a revelation from Satan or some other, you know, malevolent force that is impersonating God? Like, how do you tell if it's a legitimate, genuine revelation? Don't you have to employ some method, like the scientific method? Don't you have to test it somehow? Don't you have to verify it? Don't you have to find some kind of evidence? You know, even most religious folks who say that, they say, well, how do we know that God is really speaking to us? The answer I hear most often from preachers is, well, check it against the scriptures. Well, that's like an experiment. You're looking for evidence. And I don't see how we know anything unless we use the scientific method. We might not always think of it as the scientific method, and it's not always, you know, laboratory experiments and controlled tests, but it's testing things against the evidence. If you don't do that, how do you know anything? Yes, of course, God must be known through the scientific method.
Out of 4 atheists, the amazing atheist had the most tenable position, and that fact alone gives me a headache. He didn't conflate empiricism and science, and he granted that there could be a sound argument for the existence of God that doesn't rely on premises supported by empirical evidence. Unfortunately, the other atheists answered roughly in the following fashion. Yes, God must be known through the scientific method because science is the only way we can know anything. Now, aside from there being no such thing as the scientific method, this position commits at least 2 other errors as well, which are both guilty of scientism. The first error is that God must be known through the scientific method. The second is to make the naive grand declaration of scientism. Broadly defined, scientism is the position that science offers the only way to gain knowledge. The second and more narrow use of the term is any attempt to use science to answer non-scientific questions. For example, one might believe that science is not the only way to gain knowledge, but if one were to say that science determines moral values or metaphysical possibility, then one would be, in this particular case, guilty of scientism. On either the broad or narrow account, scientism is the attempt to expand science's epistemic limits to the point where it breaks down and offers no insight. With these definitions in mind, I can now begin to address why the first error, that God must be known through the scientific method, is an instance of scientism. Here, it needs to be first established whether God is a supernatural being or not, And if God is a supernatural being, it then must be established if science is capable of demonstrating the existence or non-existence of supernatural beings. Oftentimes, when the theistic concept of God is being argued for or against, it is defined as a supernatural being, and this should not come as a big surprise to most people. After all, God is generally portrayed as a maximally great being who exists outside of and created the natural world. So if it's agreed upon that a supernatural being's existence is being called into question here, then we can now turn to science's ability or inability to demonstrate the existence or non-existence of supernatural beings. And to help explore this little debate, I'll use a somewhat recent exchange between Massimo Pigliucci and the late Vic Stenger. A few years ago, the biologist turned philosopher Massimo Pigliucci published a paper that was critical of the characteristic scientism of New Atheism. To no one's surprise, scientismists and their sympathizers were incredibly annoyed by this criticism, and during this indignant period, a response was penned by Vic Stenger, in which he disparaged the position of scientism while also flirting with scientism. It was an odd response, to say the least. Again, I bring up this exchange because Pigliucci and Stenger hit on the topic of what science can tell us about God's existence or non-existence, and I figure it would be more productive to cite their exchange rather than having a low-rent Pigliucci, myself, dismantle low-rent Stinger's YouTube atheists. So here I'll be quoting Pigliucci's response to Stinger's response to Pigliucci's original paper, but there will be a link to all three in the description of this video. Inevitably, Stenger gets around to what really seems to bother him: my contention that there is no such thing as the God hypothesis, and that to insist along those lines is yet another clear instantiation of scientism. I never said, for instance, that specific empirical claims made by or on behalf of one religious doctrine or another cannot be rejected on scientific grounds. Does Stenger think I am agnostic about whether the Earth is 6,000 or a few billion years old? Obviously I am not, and that is certainly a good example of an empirical claim settled by science. But I don't think that falsifying that sort of claim amounts to a rejection of the God hypothesis. This for the simple reason that saying things like, God did it, doesn't arise remotely close to the lofty level of a hypothesis, let alone a scientifically testable one. Stenger chastises me for not having discussed his central and unique argument in God, the failed hypothesis, in which he allegedly disproves the existence of God on scientific grounds. To begin with, I did not address Stinger's book in detail in my original paper for two reasons. First, his argument, Stinger's protestations notwithstanding, is actually not qualitatively different from Dawkins, and the latter's book came out a year earlier. Second, and more important, since I don't think God is a hypothesis to begin with, it follows that, a fortiori, I don't think it can be disproven. As physicist Wolfgang Pauli famously put it in another context, it is not even wrong, in my book. Stenger nevertheless goes on at length summarizing his approach toward the falsification of the God hypothesis, but he doesn't really break any new ground. All the arguments he brings up are well known, and have been discussed for many years before the first New Atheist book hit the bookstores. Moreover, he doesn't seem to realize that many of those arguments constitute the very same reasons I myself am an atheist. I just don't think those reasons are particularly scientific, though some are certainly science-informed, and I also don't think they constitute disproof. Let me give you a few representative examples. His first exhibit is that, quote, no violations of physical law were required to produce the universe, its laws, or its existence rather than non-existence, end quote, which is immediately followed by, quote, current cosmological theories strongly suggest that our universe is just one of an unlimited number of other universes in a multiverse that always existed, in which case there never was a creation, end quote. Do we have scientific explanations of how the universe came about from nothing? We don't at this moment. Or does science tell us that the universe did not have a beginning? It doesn't yet. It can't be both, because those are logically mutually exclusive possibilities. Besides, Stenger here engages in the sort of activity that Jim Baggett unceremoniously labeled fairy tale physics, way overstating what we know, presenting highly speculative, though certainly fascinating, hypotheses from contemporary fundamental physics as pretty much established facts. Dare I say, scientism? The God hypothesis, further tells us Stenger, has been disproven on the grounds that the universe doesn't show any of the expected signs of design. And what would such signs look like, exactly? One of the most intriguing design hypotheses currently floating out there, and one that is not traditionally religious in nature is the so-called simulation hypothesis, flirted with by some philosophers and mathematically inclined physicists. The idea is that our universe may actually be a gigantic mathematical simulation designed and run by intelligent programmers who would be literally outside of our space and time. Our so-called laws of physics, then, would really be the basic parameters of the simulation. And miracles, if they occurred, would take the form of alterations or suspensions of such parameters. Now, assuming for the sake of argument that the simulation hypothesis is true, what sort of signs should we expect that would allow us to detect the simulators? What kind of evidence of your presence could possibly be present to the characters in a Sims video game? Now, the second error, that science offers the only way to know anything, is easily countered. For example, I could easily point out that I know I won't fall through my apartment floor because I've taken thousands of steps around my apartment without the floor collapsing. Another example is that I know which key will open the door to my apartment because I succeeded in doing so many times before. In either case, I'm simply using observation and inductive reasoning, and again, most would say that through these methods, I know that my floor won't collapse, and I know which key will open my door. But knowing something through inductive reasoning or observation is not a sufficient condition for something to be scientific. To the scientismists out there, do you really want to say that I'm conducting a scientific experiment whenever I walk around a building or unlock a door? But there are atheists and scientismists who will say that I am doing science when I perform these mundane tasks. This move, however, opens a whole unquenchable can of philosophical thirst worms. A notable case of this can be found in Sam Harris's thoughts in Metaethics, where he makes the very bold claim that science can determine human values, but will then make his thesis boring and, in a large sense, trivial by defending it with a very broad and encroaching definition of science.
With a question like, can science tell us right from wrong? It's being construed as being, is it a replacement value system entire, right? So what you're saying is it can inform decisions, but whether it actually becomes a
I
entire
ultimately think
system.
ultimately think it is, but I think it is even stronger than that. It is, in some sense, the basis of many of our values, many of our Enlightenment values, and I think that's implicitly what many of us in this room are arguing for, exist because of the results of the scientific method and the Renaissance that resulted from them.
I think that's actually a source of confusion. I totally agree with you, but that we're using science in very different senses in this conversation.
I think you're right.
There's a lot of confusion about certainly what I mean by science. I did not mean for a moment to defend science in the very narrow sense as experimental science, men in white lab coats scanning brains as the only source of morality, and that's really a straw man. I mean science in a much broader sense, the sort that Steve invoked, of secular rationality and honest truth claims based on honest observation and honest and clear reasoning. And we all are citizen scientists in many of our, or honorary scientists in many of our moments. And insofar as we're intellectually honest and trying to have our beliefs about the world and our certainty about those beliefs kind of scale with the evidence. And that is the source of clear thinking about the possibilities of human and animal well-being.
Along with possibly including opening doors and walking on floors as science, this broad conception of science also opens the floodgates to pseudoscience being reclassified as science. On Scientia Salon, there's a blog post that goes more into depth with this problem, which can be found in the description. But roughly put, it makes the demarcation problem even more troublesome than before. In philosophy of science, there's a genuine concern about how we demarcate science from pseudoscience. This is the demarcation problem. And if we make the definition of science as broad as Sam Harris or other atheists would like to, then we're committed to saying that ghost hunting or intelligent design are scientific. After all, they use observation and reasoning, and therefore fulfill the criteria to be considered scientific. This is the demarcation problem gone wild. An obvious counter that proponents of such a broad definition of science could bring up is that these fields remain pseudoscientific because the conclusions they reach are false. But so what? A lot of conclusions that have been reached by science have been overturned and proven false. But that doesn't make the last couple hundred years of modern science pseudoscience. the demarcation problem isn't so easily circumvented. That said, to even refute scientism by deferring to induction and observation alone is to be too charitable. There are plenty of examples where we do not need induction, observation, nor science in order to acquire knowledge. There are truths that are independent of these ways of knowing. At this point, I was going to list a bunch of examples that fit this description. My go-to examples include logical, mathematical, ethical, and metaphysical truths. But before making this video, I found a William Lane Craig clip where he lists and gives a brief explanation of many of my examples. Ultimately, I decided to use this clip for two reasons. First, Peter Atkins, the atheist William Lane Craig is addressing, is a scientismist, and every time the camera cuts to his face, you can clearly see his world imploding. Second, using William Lane Craig in order to refute scientism will no doubt piss off any scientismists who end up watching this video. And yeah, if that's not a recipe for entertainment, then I don't know what is.
But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science...
So what can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give. I think there are a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, but that we're all rational to accept. Let me list 5. Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method.